I've always heard stories of the South Island's wild west coast, but this was the first time I got to see it for myself.
We're on the west coast of the South Island of New Zealand at Punakaiki Rocks. It's also called the Blowing Rocks. Basically, there's these pancake formations, and at high tide, water gushes through this. It's a really cool spot. They have a nice scenic walkway, and there's all these really cool vantage points you can set up. Now, what we noticed today is the sky started to do this amazing thing where it was super cloudy on the top, but there was a strip of clear clouds between the cloud line and the water line. So I set up here so I could get some of this pancake rock formation as well as the sky, because what I'm waiting for here is for the sun to breach the bottom of that cloud line, fall between the water and the clouds, and shoot really intense golden light on this foreground right here. Right now you can see that since the sun is behind that thick curtain of clouds, the foreground is really flat, dull, and uninteresting. So once the sun starts to appear, it's going to cast light on the scene and it's going to come alive. I'm trying to set everything up very quickly because once that sun breaks the cloud line, I'm only going to have a few short minutes to capture this scene. There are a few cool locations to shoot these rocks, and honestly, this one is not my favorite. I would have preferred to be a little further over there and shooting the whole coastline with these rocks. But since the sky looked like it was going to be beautiful, I decided to change the composition, sacrifice some of the composition element to frame the sky, which I think is going to make for a really beautiful shot, combining some of this foreground with the epic sky behind it. Putting the sun right in the frame is going to introduce a few challenges that we have not dealt with yet in landscape photography. Mainly, we're going to be shooting into such an intense ball of light that I'm going to need all 9 exposure brackets to account for the incredible dynamic range. Now, I'm going to need more of those brackets on the low end and the shadow side because I want to make sure I can get the shape of the sun to be as small as possible so then I can expand it a little bit in post. If I were to shoot this with a single exposure, the sky is going to be so blown out that I'm not going to be able to see anything at all. So I'm going to use all of those 9 exposure brackets in camera to illustrate the great amount of dynamic range. In post, I may only need to pull 1 or 2 to finalize the shot. All right, so it looks like the sun is about to break the cloud line. I'm gonna go ahead and get everything ready to get this shot. So the light's perfect now, so I'm gonna go ahead and take my bracketed exposures while I have the time. This is really complicated. What I'm trying to do is frame a composition here with the sun in it because the sky looks amazing. So I'm making sure everything's in focus. I'm going up to f11 and I'm shooting 9 bracketed exposures. So I'm gonna do my 9 right now. 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9 at f11. And the 9 is to cover the low end because I want to get the sun as small as possible. Problem is when I do that, the sun is leaving a massive glare on the frame because basically the glare happens because the sun is hitting the glass on the front of the lens. So what I'm going to do is cover the sun, and on the back of my camera I can actually see that it's cleaned up all that glare, and I'm going to shoot those brackets again. Now I know this seems a little bit funny, like it's kind of a silly solution, but this will remove all of the glare from the sun because I'm blocking that glare hitting the front of the glass. So now, inside of Photoshop, I'm gonna have to go in and use most of the hand-free images and then composite in the foreground from where I blocked the sun to get rid of the glare. Some of you guys might be wondering, to decrease that dynamic range, why did I not use a Format High-Tech graduated neutral density filter? Because I do use these often. But here's the thing, the glare happens from the intense light hitting the front of the lens. The glass refracts that light and causes all of this glare. The more glass you put in front of your lens, especially this being a flat surface and a large surface, the more glare I'm gonna have to deal with. So taking this off actually mitigated the amount of glare I'm gonna have to clean up. I know that seems a little bit funny because I was using my hand, but I have to be really careful that when I cover the sun, I don't cover any of the foreground as well, because then I'm gonna have this area that I don't have a clean spot with. So I'm gonna have to be really careful in post that I blend the foreground without my hand in with the non-glare version that my hand's in. Any additional glass would have caused more glare to have to clean up. Now, I love using neutral density filters, but I do have to warn you of something else. A lot of you guys are shooting with neutral clear glass on the front of the lens, the ones that the camera shops sell you to protect the front. It's just a standard UV filter. If you have a UV filter on the front of your lens, you're gonna get much more glare and sometimes even a lens flare. So if you're gonna shoot right into the sun, the best thing to do is just take off that neutral clear or UV filter, whatever it is. You're gonna have a better shot overall because you're gonna have less glare. So the sun's gone down all the way on the horizon now. Once the sun goes about halfway down the horizon, there's no need to cover it up with a second set of exposures with your hand. Reason being is it's not bright enough to cause any glare. So you only need to do the hand covering the sun trick if the sun is gonna cause glare on your foreground by bouncing light off the front of your lens. Coming to this location here, I didn't expect to frame the shot this way. I had something completely different intended, but I'm really glad that I decided to pick up my camera, move it to a location that framed the sun. So it's a good example of when you need to be more dynamic in your shooting environment. Even if you've come for something really specific, you have to change and adapt to the changing weather conditions around you. So this is a really good example of that. And it's gonna be the most dynamic range that we've covered in a while. Plus, I've already shot it one way without my hand in the frame, and now I have another complete set of brackets with my hand in the frame, and we're gonna have to combine and work with all of those images in post and in Photoshop to make one complete image. Welcome back to the post-processing studio for lesson 13, New Zealand pancake rocks. Now remember, when we were in the field, I shot 9 exposure brackets and then I shot an additional 9 exposure brackets with my hand covering the sun. Now think back to the video portion of this. That was to remove the lens flare that I was getting on the front of the glass. So what we're going to do here is a little bit different than we've done before. We've talked about channel masking, replacing skies, and we've talked a little bit about luminosity masking. But this time we're going to get a little bit more in-depth with luminosity masking, and we're going to create our own version that's kind of a throwback to how we used to process things in HDR software. So we're going to use multiple exposures to try to get the sun to be as small as possible in the frame. So it's going to require a little bit more knowledge and a little bit more in-depth processing than we've done before. After we create our base blend, I'm going to use the shot where my hand's covering the sun, and we're going to blend in the clean portion with no lens flare. Now it may sound a little bit complicated now, but it's actually quite simple, and I think you guys are going to like the process. Here we are again using Capture One. Now I chose to use Capture One for the rest of this video, so the last few lessons we're going to be doing are all inside of Capture One. If you want to go ahead and download the free trial, they give you 30 or 60 days for free with no watermarking, so it'll give you a good idea if you like the workflow. Based on the last lesson, you know that it's a lot like Lightroom. It's just the buttons are a little bit different, the sliders are named something different, but the color is pretty nice for landscapes. We really don't have to push it quite as far as we normally do inside of Adobe Lightroom. So let's take a look at what we have here. We have 9 exposure brackets here, and then if I scroll down a little bit more, we have 9 more with my hand covering them. Now I like to shoot into the sun fairly often because it gives me a really nice dynamic lighting environment. Anytime that I shoot into the sun, I always shoot an extra couple of brackets to cover the sun up. 9 exposure brackets was a little bit overboard, to be honest, where I tend to usually try to blow out the sun a little bit, but I shot 9 specifically so I'd have an example here in post-processing so that we could get that sun to be as small in the frame as possible. The higher up the sun is in the sky, typically the more exposure brackets that you need. The lower it is in the sky, the more diffuse the light is because of the environmental haze on the horizon. Softer light means less exposures, less intensity, and therefore less exposure brackets. So in this case, we have all 9. Let's go ahead and take a look at what we have. Now this is the metered exposure, and as you can see, that sun is extremely hot. Not only is it hot, but it's gone. We have this harsh highlight here that we cannot recover. Even if I slide the highlights back, you can see that it tries to recover it, but it basically just makes that hot spot a little bit smaller. It doesn't bring the sun integrity back.
But let's back it up a little bit. If we go back to the original base exposure, or sorry, 4 back from the original base exposure to a -4, you can see now we're starting to see the edge of the sun with very little banding disturbance. So here's where it gets a little bit difficult. This file is extremely different. It has 4 stops of difference between here and here. How do we seamlessly blend these things together manually? Well, when you have extreme cases of light, like this situation, it helps to find a middle ground. So the first thing I want to do is figure out my extremes. This pretty much makes up some of the intensity of the foreground, really even up to about here. This is how I want my foreground to look, so somewhere around this area. But I want my highlights to look like this. So what I'm going to do is pick the highlights and the shadows, which are these 2 layers, and I've marked them green here for your convenience so you can actually see which ones I'm talking about. And in the middle, I'm just going to go ahead and select a midtone. So instead of starting with this one and then trying to blend in that hot spot of the sun, I'm going to start in the middle and then blend in part of the shadows increased here and part of the highlights first. So the first thing I'm going to have to do is resolve this, doing the basic color correction and get it to a really nice par, a really good mid-tone image that I can blend the other ones into. Let's make our adjustments. First thing I want to do is just go ahead and bring up the overall exposure. Now remember I was telling you guys you can basically bring out a full 2 stops in the shadows and 1 in the highlights. We already tried to bring the highlights back here. We know that it didn't work too well. So I'm just doing an overall bump in the exposure, and now I'm going to do recovery in the high dynamic range section here for highlights and shadows. We'll go ahead and change this one here. We'll go about 2. Let's just bring some of that back. I think about 40, and then now I want to bring the foreground back. Now remember, this is going to be my midtones, so I just want to go ahead and start with a baseline edit here, something that I can blend into. Now obviously with this file, I'm going to bring in better versions of the shadows, and with this file here, better versions of the highlights, but this is going to be my starting base image. So with these settings applied, I'm going to right-click, export variants, and bring this into Photoshop. Now that this is in Photoshop, let's go back to Capture One. Remember that Capture One's going to let me know it exported a file. Click OK to clear that notification. Now that we have a baseline, I need to get these highlights in there. I need to fix this hot spot in the sun. So let's go to the image that we're going to use for the highlights. And now what I'm going to do is try to bring back these shadows a little bit to compensate. Basically, it's easier, remember, I've said this a few times, it's easier to blend something into itself if the tonality is similar. If you blend an image that has black shadows over an image that has really nice shadows, really well exposed shadows, then anywhere that that overlaps, we're going to see those black edges. So what I want to do is just bring this back to something that's a little bit more normal and a little more closely resembles what I'm blending it into. Let's go ahead and recover the shadows just to try to bring it back a little bit. Now I'm not going to go too far, and you notice just from 0 to about 65, you can see that that sky actually turns into something that's a little bit nicer, a little bit easier on the eyes. It's not going to be quite as dark. So I'm going to go ahead and use this for the highlights. So I'm going to right click, again, export variants, just so I can get it out of the program and into Photoshop. Let's bring this into our other document, select all, copy, close, and paste. All right, so that is quite a bit different. You can see that our original layer here is a little bit blown out, but we want to get that ball of the sun right in there. So what are our options? Well, option number 1 would be to basically apply a mask, and I'm going to do that by option clicking here, and I could maybe try to custom paintbrush this in. Let's see what happens if I just try to paint this in, just with a low flow maybe of 20%. Maybe I can bring that globe in, and it looks pretty good, but anywhere I start to overlap, you can see that I'm getting this dark edge. And so anywhere I try to paint this in, you can see that I'm getting this bad, negative, sort of reverse halo thing. That's sort of the signs of a bad HDR image. So we're using these manual processes so that we can do this as seamless as possible. So going back to a technique that we used before, I essentially want this image only to exist inside of the highlights of this image below. So if I load the channel palette here, I can create a selection of just the highlights. So I'm going to create a luminosity mask, just the highlights, by command clicking RGB. Now remember, we've been looking at this a lot. Each one of these channels contains luminance data that can be loaded by holding command and clicking. In this case, I'm going to select the all RGB, go back to layers, and I'm going to create a folder for this applied to. So once this is applied to the folder, if I throw this inside of that folder, now it'll only exist inside of the highlights. So right off the bat, you can see that now where it blends over, it only overlaps the shadows a little bit. And if I look at this mask, this is the big controlling mask for this image. Anywhere where it's black, it doesn't exist. Anywhere where it's white, it exists. So right here around the sun, 100% opacity, and it starts to fall off around the clouds. This is really powerful because if I don't do anything else, you can see that this blends fairly seamlessly over top without any adjustment. The problem is some of this gets a little bit darker. So what I can do is start to mask this out just a little bit. And I'm going to do that using a very clean method. I could actually just paint it back in if I wanted, just parts of it. Or I can just use a gradient map to get rid of a lot of it. So in one swoop, what I want to do is actually remove a portion of this just like this. I'm going to draw a gradient ramp here to here. And you can see that now I've started to remove it. I'm going to do a little bit of a better job there. So maybe from here to here. And that looks pretty good. I'm going to turn the opacity down on this just a little bit to compensate so I can bring some of that intensity back to the sun while still maintaining the shape of the sun. And now what I can do is just sort of custom paint out some of the sky. So if I select the brush tool here, I'm going to do a very small flow, medium-sized brush, the 10% flow, and I'm just going to start sort of painting out some of this area here to bring it back. And you can see that this is just basically a manual process here of bringing some of this back, so bringing some of the background back. And you can see that if I do this on and off here, I basically have a pretty nice baseline image to work with. And I'm just going to paint. I'm kind of a perfectionist when it comes to this kind of stuff. Just going to paint it out. Now we've brought the highlights in, so now we have the globe of the sun and leaving the integrity of the foreground in place. Next step, we're going to go back to Capture One, and we're going to address the shadows. So remember, we have highlights, we have our base midtone, and now we're going to adjust the shadows. So the highlights are pretty much messed up here. We can't get them back, but we can adjust the shadows. So let's go ahead and adjust the shadows here. Bring those up to something that looks really nice. I'm going to recover the highlights not because I want to get this globe back, but because I want to fix some of what's happening in the water. So let's go ahead and make some changes here. And I may even want to change the exposure just a little tiny bit, just to bring it up just a hair. Highlights, and this is done to taste. And if I don't like it, I can always bring in a new version, but I want to get it as close as possible before I bring it in. So that looks pretty good. Let's go ahead and export this and bring it into Photoshop. Select all, copy, close up this folder here and paste. It'll come in right on top. So this is actually what's kind of cool is we've created this mask here. This mask is basically just for the highlights. So it's a luminosity selection of the RGB channel. If I invert this mask, it reverses it. So it knocks out the highlights and only focuses on the shadows. So what I'm actually going to do is reselect this again. I don't have to go back to the channels palette since it's already here. I can command click it, and I'm going to create another folder, and I'm going to go ahead and apply it. Now this is really cool because I can invert this channel now since it's a highlight selection. If I do Command I on the keyboard, it'll invert it, and now it'll become a selection just for the shadows. So that's pretty useful. So now with my shadow layer, I can drop that in, and you can see that it will not affect the sky. And if I just do this one-to-one over top, you can see that it looks pretty good, but it is affecting the areas that I don't really want it to affect. So the next thing I'm going to do is add another mask here, and I'm going to do the same thing that I did with the other layer. I'm going to use the gradient, but this time I'm going to go ahead and mask it all off this way, so that now this part is the only part that comes into play. So this mask shadow controls the shadows for the entirety of anything that's inside of this folder, and now in this area I can say that I just want it to exist inside of the shadows and inside of this specific region. Now I may have sort of messed up this area and made this a little bit dark. So what I can do, just like I did last time, I can unlink this, and instead of changing the layer, the last one I changed the layer, moved the layer independently of the mask, I can actually transform the mask itself with a Command T, and you can see that I can go ahead and change this and sort of get it to be right where I want it. So about there. I'll relink it again, and now turn this on and off, and you can see that it's looking pretty good. I may actually want to add some of it back in the sky just because the sky looks a little bit dark. So I'll go ahead and select the brush tool again. We'll do a medium-sized brush, and we'll paint in a little bit of white, just a little tiny bit with a light flow, and you can see that that's going to pick up some of those values there for the sun. And that looks pretty good. So what we've been able to do here is a fairly complex blend. So this is a 3-exposure blend. We shot 9. We used the best 3 for this scene, and we were able to use simple luminosity masking for shadows and highlights to bring in the clarity of the little dot of the sun and all of the texture in the shadows in the foreground. Once we're happy with this blend, the next step is to blend in the additional frame that's going to get rid of all of these flares and all of the sun flare and just negative effects of that sun hitting the front of the lens. Let's go back to capture 1. I've used these 3 exposures here, but let's go ahead and roll down, and I've actually green flagged the one that I want to use. It is also the mid exposure for my hand over the sun trick. You'd actually see I'm getting a little bit of a sun flare through my fingers. That's actually pretty cool. Not planned, but it actually looks kind of cool. Again, my hand ruins the scene. But you can see again, now we looked at this in camera and we looked at this through the video portion of this tutorial, but if you actually side by side these things together, you can see the glare that's happening here, and you can see that here it is completely free of any of that. So this is really nice because it's going to allow me to use this portion of the image over top of this image, and since the camera stayed stationary, my hand just covered this up, I shot the same amount of exposure bracketing, exposure brackets, excuse me, that this should be pretty seamless when it stacks up. So let's go ahead and select that again. I'm going to make some minor adjustments to it. I'm going to just recover a little bit of the highlights just for this area around here, and I'm going to pick up the shadows just a tiny little bit. Not much at all. I'm not really going to do much at all to this image, and I'm going to go ahead and export it again, and you guessed it, variants and 1 variant. Select all, copy, close, and now paste on top. So here we go. So we go from this to this. Now this is actually going to be really easy. Since I don't care about the top of the image, it can be all blown out. What I'm going to do, the first thing I'm going to do is create a gradient here. So I created my mask already. I'm going to select the gradient tool, and I'm going to probably just draw white to black here, just like that. And now I'm going to custom paint the rest of this back in. So here I'll zoom in so we can see this very closely. This is called a lens flare. A lens flare is because the light is hitting the front of the camera, and I can get rid of this very easily. I don't even have to paint at full opacity, and I can start to bring back some of these subtle details. We also have greater clarity when the sun isn't hitting the front of the lens, so I'll just go ahead and uniformly bring this back in. I also want to make sure that I keep, basically I keep the new entirety of the water. You see the water actually has a flare over it, so you can see this water here just covers all that up and looks fine with the water wash. I want to be very careful here though, because I get these really nice burst rays, sun rays here. If I start to add the other image in, you can see that I'm going to get close to my hand, but I'm also going to get rid of those rays. So I have to be very careful not to add my hand back in and just remove the little areas of flare that I want to not happen and not be have an impression on the screen. And that looks pretty good. It's all blended. Now it's time to take it to the next step. So we want to make sure before we take it to the next step, before we remove all those spots on the lenses, before we start to clone things out, we want to make sure that we like the way everything looks. So if I just turn everything off and I just make sure that we did this the right way, you can see that I've fixed the sun, I've brought the sun back, and then I've also picked up the shadows again. Now it's nice, with my final layer intact, I don't have to worry too much about the shadows, but what I'm really concerned about are these subtleties with the sky. How much of this sun do I want to see? And the more I turn this up, you can see the more it's going to bring that and make it intense. So if I turn this down a little bit, it's going to bring up the intensity. If I turn it up, it's going to really make that sun a globe. So I'm going to find sort of a happy median to work at, somewhere that you can see the shape of the sun, but still has an impact, still seems bright. Now it's interesting with this kind of stuff, if you're doing these scenes shooting right into the sun, people expect there to be a little bit of intensity because, well, it's the sun. It's extremely intense. So usually with something like this, I probably would elect to have a big sun burst. So sort of coming at the camera, not really seeing the shape of the sun, but this is a preferred look for a lot of photographers, and in some of my work, depending on the way the sun looks, I do like to see the shape of the sun. So using this masking, these simple masking techniques to be able to blend all this back together gives you the ability to have really good control over every aspect of the shot. So you have control over the shadows, control over the extreme highlights, the shape of the sun, all of this. So using this technique will basically give you the ability to never have to use HDR software again, because now using just simple shadow and luminosity masks, we can create our own blend. So if I say that this is good, I want to go ahead and move on, I'm going to do what I usually do here, and I'm going to bring everything into a folder and call it blend. Right now I'm just trying to stay organized because the first thing that I want to do is address any water spots that are on the lens, any dust spots. And I'm going to do that by zooming in here to the sky. Now, I'm sure there are some hiding around here somewhere. There always are. With a lot of texture and detail in the sky, however, we're not really going to see them. And since I was shooting at a pretty decent f-stop, I think it's going to be okay. But you can see I have one spot here, I have another bigger spot here, and I have another lens flare that's happening in the sky. I couldn't get rid of that with my hands, so what I'm going to do is create one new layer on top. Now, since I have a lot of blending happening, I like to create a new layer. This layer with the healing brush here intact. It's going to make sure that it samples all layers, which is everything below, and then I can just go ahead and remove these little issues. So anything that I see now, I'm going to go ahead and remove, clean it up, and make sure that it looks pretty good. And of course, I'm probably going to miss some that I'll have to clean up later. But one other thing that I want to do is I want to address this composition. Remember, when I was shooting this, I said this wasn't my favorite composition. Well, that's true. I elected to shoot into the sun to have something a little bit more unique. The other composition, I liked the way the rocks looked, but I didn't have any drama in the sky, and I didn't have all the lighting. So this was a compromise. And I was standing on top of this rock, and I was pointing it down. And when I did that, you can see that I have a little bit of the rock in the foreground. I love this rock here on the left. I love the light here, but this is bothering me. Just this little rock seems out of place. So what I'm going to do is zoom in, and I'm going to paint this out. We've already learned how to remove both Lee and Patrick and Taurus from the frame. We've learned different ways to do that, but this is so simple we're going to do it with the clone stamp. The reason being is all we have to do is bring in some of these flowers and some of these details. So on that same layer that I created to address the sky, I'm going to select the clone stamp, hold Option, and grab some of the detail here. Just grab anywhere along here. We have some of these flowers, some of these white spots, and some of the green, and I'm actually just going to pick moderate flow around 30, and I'm just going to go ahead and paint this back in. Now this is the best case scenario with painting because it's all this random detail. There's nothing uniform about this at all, so I don't have to be precise. I just need to grab portions and make sure that the tonality matches up. So for here, this area, rather than grabbing over here, I'll grab from up here, where it's just a little bit mossy. I'll bring that back in, and basically paint. If nobody knew it was there in the first place, with this kind of correction, nobody's going to know that you made any changes whatsoever, especially when it's at the bottom of the frame. Well, let's take a look at that, and that looks a little bit better to me. Now I like the composition a little bit more. There's less distraction. In fact, speaking of distraction, anything that looks too distracting with a composition like this, because a composition like this, to be honest, is a little busy, in my opinion. There's a lot going on. The sun's kind of hitting the camera. We have a lot of texture, a lot of colors. So anything that's too distracting, any of these objects that feel like they're out of place or they're pulling my attention away, I'm just going to kind of look at. Like even this little white spot, this may seem nitpicky, but some of this stuff just seems a little bit too strange, and it pulls my attention away. So I just want to get rid of anything that's distracting so I can just focus on the scene, make sure my eye isn't drawn to anything. Obviously, if there was anything here, if anybody left any soda cans, beer bottles, stuff like that, we definitely have to get rid of it. If Patrick was doing a jump selfie right here that he usually does, we'd have to get rid of him as well. Or if Lee flew the drone into the frame, which he frequently did, we'd have to get rid of the drone. But in this case, everything looks really clean, so we can move on to the next step. Since this is all a folder here, Shift, Option, Command, E will make a new layer out of everything in my composition, throw it on top, and allow us to apply Color Effects Pro. Here we are in Color Effects Pro, and Pro Contrast is the last thing that I use, so it's already here. I'm going to change the dynamic contrast. It's funny how often I rely on this to add that extra kick to my images. Anytime we're doing any blending, we're trying to get everything to look at par. So it's basically a lot of midtones. We haven't really compressed the levels to make it look like it has a full range of tonality. So these plugins help us really quickly get back some of that tonality and some of that pop in the image. So I'm going to make some minor adjustments here. I'm going to go ahead and see what correct color cast does. In this case, you can see it cools the whole thing down, which I don't like. I love the warm tones. So I'm going to leave that alone and just adjust this. And I'm going to adjust it to taste. And I'm also going to add my contrast color range. A lot more contrast. In the beginning, again, it's one of those annoying things about this plugin. You have to keep resetting it but once you do reset it, it allows you to make some nice little adjustments to the image. Now this is going to be doing two things. If I turn this all the way up, you can see that, well, one, it looks really horrible, but what it's trying to do is add some more intensity of light, which is really nice. I like that. But it's also adding intensity here, so I have to be careful. What I want to do is add a little tiny bit without getting rid of the color. So this is just going to be a little bit of intensity overall. So with the Pro Contrast, contrast color range, I can get a little bit more pop to the image and have now a new step, a new baseline image to work on. We'll go ahead and apply it. Very nice. And actually a nice change from our blend now to something that's a little bit more intense, has a little bit more pop and personality. Looking at this though, there's a lot of detail in the foreground, and I feel like the sky still needs a little bit of a punch. So what can we do to really pop out the drama of the sky? It almost looks like this is an eye, and it's sort of an eyebrow, and this is staring at us. Since it's in New Zealand, it could be like the Eye of Sauron. The Eye of Sauron is everywhere in New Zealand. So what can we do to really bring out this detail? Let's do one more thing in Color Efex Pro. Now that I'm back in Color Efex Pro, we'll go to Tonal Contrast, and you can see the tonal contrast just kicks up all those shadows and highlights. I'm going to make this pretty subtle, maybe 6, 8, 8, and 0. And I'm just going to turn this on and off to see if that kicked up the sky a little bit. May want to bring the midtones up to 10, which looks pretty good, and toggle that on and off, and you can see that it's bringing out those details in the sky a little bit. It's also bringing out the details in the foreground, which I may or may not want. And I'm not going to use any U points here, I'm just going to go ahead and apply it. There we go. Now we have a little bit more detail. So this is interesting. So I really like what it's doing to the sky, and I kind of like what it's done to the shadows in the image. But notice that the shadows, it's kind of really enhancing these edges. It's giving it a little bit more sort of punch in the shadows, but it might be a little bit more overwhelming than I'm willing to have here. I do really like what it's doing here, but I don't like it here so much. So what I'm going to do is go ahead and create a mask on this, and I'm going to control very specifically where this adjustment, where this tonal contrast falls. Oh, I know that I really like it in the sky, but I start to like it, less and less as it gets to the bottom of the image. So let's just say that we like it 100% here and 0% here. And I'm going to draw this gradient to reflect. So now this tonal contrast is only going to be alive inside of the top of this image into these rocks and not in the foreground. So that looks pretty good. Now I've been able to control it. I probably could have done this with U points, but a mask and a gradient ramp on that mask is an even 0 to 100% fall of where I want this, from the top to the bottom of the image. What I'm going to do is duplicate the layer underneath it, and I'm just going to merge the layer above down so that I have a clean layer on top. And that's going to give me the ability to duplicate this layer and create a high-pass filter or apply more effects on top of that. So I don't have a mask layer with a partial effect, now I have a whole layer to work with. Examining the result of this tonal contrast a little bit more, I'm going to go ahead and zoom in here just a little bit. I want to show you guys that the more things you do to enhance the details using Color Efex Pro, if you use Detail Extractor or Tonal Contrast, it's going to reveal, since it's adding contrast, more of those spots. It's also going to reveal more noise in the image. So that's something to keep in mind. This is another reason why I keep those selections subtle, 5, 10, 15% instead of 50. It's not just because it makes it look better, it just gives me a better result overall and less cleanup or less hassle of revealing all these spots. So since we've done these adjustments, now I have to go in and address these issues. I'm going to do it right on the layer though, and again, I'm just going to use that spot healing brush to get rid of anything that's extremely noticeable. It's interesting too with skies, because dramatic skies like this, areas that might look like they're a mistake like this, it's not actually a spot, it's just part of the sky. So that helps and hurts us, because sometimes we can find these spots, and sometimes these spots are actually naturally occurring textures and patterns inside of the clouds. So we have to use our judgment to figure out what seems to be a distracting element and what seems to be a natural element. Something like this obviously is on the camera, it's not part of the sky, but this little subtle stuff in the clouds here, this subtlety, is probably part of the actual image. Anything like this, that's not actually a spot. We'll just brush through this one more time really quick just to be sure. See, there's some in the water here, to be very careful of that. Just clean it up, make sure it's not there in the final image. If this was going to print, for example, you'd have to make sure that it is perfect. If you're sharing it on social media at 2,000 pixels or below, chances are nobody's going to notice because they can't zoom into that detail. So general rule with this kind of stuff is the larger you're going to print an image, the more you have to pay attention to these little spots and all these little details. That's good enough for now. You guys might find more when you're working on the image. So now that we've addressed that, it's time to start with the next step. And at this point, I can go either way. I can do more color correction, or I can start working on the sharpening of this image. The first thing that I want to do is do my global sharpening with a high pass filter. So since I baked this all into a single layer, I can duplicate it. And I can go ahead and say filter, other, high pass, and do our usual 3 pixels. I'll go ahead and set it to overlay mode. We know that we don't want it to pick up any of the texture of the sky. We probably don't want it in the water. So what I'm going to do is just create a gradient ramp on this really quickly, just so we can get even distribution of this from top to bottom. I want 100% of it here, and I want 0% of it here. So now we basically have the sharpening in the foreground. Well, here's where it gets a little bit interesting. I really like what it's doing, but I feel like it needs even more sharpness than this. So what I want to do is create an additional element of sharpening, selective sharpening, so that we can really focus on the areas that I want the viewer to focus. So we're going to use, once again, we're going to be using Nik Sharpener Pro. Before I do that, since this is getting fairly complex, we'll just go ahead and call this save just now so that I have it. Later on, it'll be named for the lesson when you guys want to open it. Just in case this decides to crash, I'm stacking a lot of layers. So what I can do is just go ahead and select Color Effects Pro 4, that layer that I've already created, go up to Filter, Nik Collection, Sharpener Pro Output Sharpener. We're going to add some extreme sharpening, I like to call it. Let's expand this so we can see the full view, go to the preview mode, and I'll go ahead and just kind of wipe back and forth here. We'll zoom in a little bit here for you guys. Let me go ahead and zoom right here. Yeah, that looks about good. Kind of like that. Let me go ahead and select the arrow tool here just so we can get that detail. You can see by default, if I drag this from left to right, it's ridiculous. It's almost like the image was not sharp before. Now it's extremely sharp. Again, with anything else, you might want to pull this down a little bit so it's not quite as intense. Remember, we have a high pass filter on top of this as well. I like to bring the focus up a little bit more, the output strength down just a little bit, and we'll go ahead and apply this. At this current zoom, it's kind of hard to see what this is doing, but if I zoom in a little bit, especially on these rocks here, let me center this, and I turn this on and off, you can see the detail just pops out. So that's the detail. This is the detail plus the high pass filter. So even with the high pass filter off, you can see this detail just explodes. It's crazy, these edges, really, really nice. So this gives me control over extreme sharpening. And everybody loves razor sharp, beautiful landscapes. This I want to have be a selective process. So I'm going to go ahead and create a black mask, Alt-click, black mask, and I'm going to go ahead and paint in this area, just in the spots that I want people to do it. And I'm going to pick a medium flow, somewhere around 20 to 30%, and I'm going to start painting it in. So I want extreme sharpness here where the highlights are, extreme sharpness in the foreground, and I'm going to want some extreme sharpness here so the eye will lead into it. So just like you can create compositional leading lines with different compositional elements in the field, you can do it with layering. We talk about color separation a lot. We can do it with separation of sharpness. So closer to the foreground, we can make elements razor sharp, and we can have it have less and less intensity as it moves back into space, just to create even more layering inside of our image. Again, this is making the file size much bigger, but I think it's worth having this and an extra layer of complexity here. So we'll go ahead and leave that just in the foreground. And again, we can do a before and after comparison of what it looks like here before and after. So I'm getting some nice rich detail and extreme sharpening. The next thing I kind of want to address, though, is remember when I said we added all of that noise back into the image? The more intensity we try to get out of the sky, the more noise we're going to get in the sky. And you're really going to start seeing that around the edges. So we can start to see like these little cloudy pixel problems here, just a little bit. And I shot this at an extremely low ISO, but your camera may only go to ISO 100 or 200. So if you push ISO 200, you get more noise if you change the adjustments than you do if you're pushing ISO 50. So let's go ahead and just, before we go any further, let's remove the noise in the sky. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to use define to do that. You guys remember Nick define. So let's go ahead and use filter, Nick define. When it opens, it's going to have to run through its initial analysis, which the larger the image and the slower the computer, the longer this process will take. So it applies an automatic profile. You can see that it's made a few selections of the image to try to figure out what it intuitively thinks this should be like. But what I'm going to do is zoom in here where we had those big problems. And we're going to do the before and after slider so we can slide from left to right to see if it's getting rid of any of that disturbance. And it's really not. So what I'm going to do is change automatic to manual, and I'm going to select the marquee tool, and I'm going to grab an area of interest for this that I want it to examine. I want it to examine this area and figure out how to mitigate that noise. Once I select the area, I can say measure. And now it's applied. So if we roll over this, and let's see if I can zoom in any more here. I can. Very good. And now, if we actually move this, you can see as I start to swipe this to the left, all that color noise goes away. You can see it there, before and after. It wasn't very noisy before, but now you can see it actually had a bit of artifacting. So with that intact, let's say OK and apply it. Let's examine the result here. Let's look at the sky again. Zoom way in, before noise reduction, after noise reduction. So since I've applied a very aggressive noise reduction, I've also managed to soften the sky a little bit, which is not a big deal. The texture is all still there, but some of the detail is softened out. But what is that going to do to the foreground? Well, let's look before and after. One more time, before and after, and we're losing all that rich detail that we worked so hard to achieve in sharpening. So for this define, I'm going to go ahead and just create another mask, and I just want this to be in the sky. That's it. I just want the sky to be nice. As soon as it meets the horizon line here, it's no longer soft. So all that noise reduction in the sky. This is something that you want to do with most of your images if you're going to go to print, because the print process may add extra noise. You're going to be able to see that visible noise. This will remove it all for you. If you're saving for web, again, this may be a step that you can skip. But if you're really particular about your files and you want them to look beautiful and perfect, I suggest putting define into your workflow and using it for your noise reduction. The other benefit is it comes with the Nick Collection Suite, which has all of the filters for one price. So you kind of can use it all as a one-stop shop. So there we go. We have our define result. Now that we have sharpening, we have the blendings done, I've addressed the noise in the sky, I've gotten rid of as many of those sensor dust spots as I possibly can find without really zooming in under the microscope here. It's time to address some of the tonality of the image. Well, think back to some of the earlier lessons. Remember in Iceland, when we were on the cliffs or Godafoss waterfall, the lighting was so flat that we used a much more aggressive approach for color effects. We really tried to push it to pull the values, create that separation, and push it as far as we really had to. Well, since we blended this together, this is 3 different pieces of luminosity blended together with the additional one to remove the glare. It's already really good. It had good tonality, so we don't have to push it very far. But what we might want to do is reflect a few things inside of the highlights and inside of the shadows. So what if I want to increase the intensity of the highlights from the sun here and here, and maybe in the foreground, and some of the highlights of these rocks? Well, think back to the other lessons. We were using something called dodge and burn. But since we've been using the channels a lot, I want to show you guys a more efficient way to dodge and burn. And I guess it's not right to call it a more efficient way. It's just more of a selective way. So think back to the blending that we did here when I showed you that you could have painted the sun over there, but you would have had an overlap. When we're using the paintbrush to paint in highlights and shadows, there's an overlap because we're basically just using broad brush strokes around little pieces of highlights. So what if we did something different? What if we created a selective way of painting in and dodging and burning? Well, let's go ahead and examine the channels again. Remember I said that I wanted to manipulate the highlights? Well, the sun is orange. It's casting a lot of red light on red rocks. So let's take a look at the color channels. You can see blue if I turn everything off here and just show the blue. You can see that everything's sort of flat here. Green, a little bit better, and then red. Well, here we go. There's all that red light that I'm getting. Red light, red light, red light. It's really intense here. So what if I load this as a selection? The red channel. I'll turn RGB back on, go back to the layers, and I'm going to create a folder. I like to do this all in folders. Now I'm going to create a folder here that's controlled by the red channel. So I'm going to call this red channel. Anything that I do inside of here now, whether it's a curves or a color correction, we'll just start with the curves, will only manipulate the luminosity that I selected in the red channel. So that's really nice. That means I can just change the red channel, the brightness, the contrast, just in the red channel if that's what I wanted to do. But specifically for this demonstration, what I want to do is create a dodge and burn layer. It's been a while since we used dodge and burn, so let me bring it up again. Option click the layer, and that's going to give you an option to create a new layer with a blending mode. If I select the overlay blending mode and say fill with the neutral color of 50% gray, it'll create a 50% gray layer that does nothing. Remember, if I paint white on this layer, it's going to dodge, and if I paint black on this layer, it's going to burn. So now everything's controlled by this red channel, and you can see that the red channel pretty much only has these highlights intact with a less impactful effect on the shadows. So if I paint now here, and I'll just create the brush here, my palette has a blue and a black, so if I hit D on the keyboard, D will reset the palette, X will swap foreground and background, and now I can paint with a very low flow. I can paint white. So I'll go ahead and zoom in here, and you can see now in these areas of highlights, I can actually go ahead and manipulate these highlights. You can see now I'm manipulating parts of these highlights, and I'll go ahead and do a few more here. So just these areas that I want to really accentuate this natural lighting that's coming in here. I want more light here, a little bit more light here on the water, and a little bit down here. Here's what's really interesting. Now, remember I said that this is a selective process? That's pretty cool, because if I turn this on and off, you can see that it's just affecting those highlights. But if I were to turn this mask off, this red channel, I'll just go ahead and disable it. You can see how now you're showing my brush strokes, which is what I don't want. By isolating it, by using just the red channel, whatever I do inside of this folder is only intact inside of that red channel. Since the red channel contained all of these highlights, there's going to be no spillover from any areas that I might misbrush. So I can basically just brush, and I can just do it very casually and pick up all these really great highlights. It's actually really quite powerful. So I've done one for the red channel. Let's look at the other channels and see if there's anything else that's useful for us. We have green, and we have red, and blue. Well, right now, if I look at the blue channel, you can see that the blue channel, the top of these pancake rocks are really intensely white, but then they get a little bit darker on the side. What if I wanted the tops of these rocks to be more accentuated? Would the green channel work better, the red channel, or the blue channel? In this case, it could be either the green or the blue, but I'll go ahead and load the blue channel really quick. Enable everything again. I'll create one more folder for the blue channel. And I'll name it blue, just so I don't confuse myself later. And I'll create a new layer, another dodge and burn layer, same technique as before. And I'm going to start to paint white on this again. So just around these stacks, the pancake rocks, this is why they call them pancake rocks, I'm just going to paint this in so that they start to become a little bit more intense. Really easy. Just the tops of these rocks here, tops of the rocks. Pulling out little subtle details here. And there is a little bit here I might be able to bring out some of the detail, sort of chisel out a little bit more of the detail, give it a little bit more depth. And if I turn this on and off, you can see it's selective. If I turn the blue channel off, you can see that you can start to see my brush strokes again. So it's isolating it. It's a more precise way of dodging and burning. A lot of the time you don't need this, but if you want more precision, this is a good way to get it. This is really cool because since I've created this red channel and this blue channel all on its own folder, it means that I can do a little bit more now. So while I've increased the intensity of this highlight here, what if I wanted to change the color? What if I wanted the intensity not only to be light, but I wanted it to be reds or oranges? Well, this is really great because since this is already created with a folder and I already have this color correction inside here in the form of a dodge and burn, I can just select this folder and I can add anything that I want. I could set a photo filter like we've been using, or I can go into curves, and instead of using the RGB, I could actually just tweak the red. And you can see the red will change the intensity of those rocks. So I can make those rocks even more red or even more pink. So that's very powerful. So I can basically choose anything that I want to be inside of this folder. And this is very, very powerful. So let's go ahead and pick what we want. Again, this is going to be up to you. I've shown how to use curves. I've shown how to use a photo filter. So even a photo filter, if you like the simplicity of a photo filter, you can see that you can start to turn that up and just warm up just those specific areas, and then you can paint them in and out. With photo filters, I'm not too big of a fan with this kind of effect. I like to control everything precisely with curves. So with curves, again, we can change the brightness, we can change the contrast, but we can also just go ahead and tweak the colors a little bit. So let's pull the reds up, make it a little bit more intense. And as a complementary thing, I'm going to also decrease the blue. And as I decrease the blue, that's going to make it a little bit more orange. So this is just basic colors. The nice thing about this, though, is it's all nonlinear. So if I make a change, like if I start changing the greens, I don't like the greens, I can either Control Z or, basically just tweak it back. Nothing is destructive here. What I'm trying to do with the RGB is I want to set a really nice contrast and red color, some nice tonality here. And if I turn it on and off, you can see it's affecting a lot of the reds in the image. I don't want it to affect all of the reds in the image. I just want it to be selective. So right now it's global. It's even affecting the oranges here. I might want a little bit of that. I definitely like the intensity here, so let's go ahead and black out this mask. Command-Delete on the keyboard will fill it with the background color. I'll switch back to my brush, and I'm going to start subtly painting in this area. So we'll go ahead and zoom in a little bit, make it a little easier on the eyes. With a flow of about 10 or 20, and I'm going to go ahead and paint that intensity back into the rocks. All that beautiful color intensity back into these rocks. You can even paint that warmth back into some of the tones. That looks good. Now, here's where it gets really fun. If I want to, I can also change the intensity here. I can bring that back. Bring it back here. Just bring those rocks, make it a little bit more red. I can custom paint a little bit more intensity here in the sky with this channel. Just bring that heat up, bring that color up, and you can see that I'm adding more vibrance in the sky just by doing this selectively. This is kind of cool too, because maybe this rock, maybe you want this to be more intense here. You can go back to the dodge and burn layer, and just like we're adding the color, we can actually add luminosity here to bring out those rays. So if I start to add it, just brush this in, it's selecting the red highlights, so I can actually bring some of this back, some of this tonality. It's really nice. And if I wanted to, I could actually bring the intensity of the sky up just a little bit, just by brushing that in selectively. So just inside of the red channel, I was able to grab more intensity and more color. And I can keep extending that down so that we can get more light from the sun, more intensity from the sun, and more color on these rocks too. It's a really nice thing to be able to do. Now again, at any point, I can add anything inside of these folders, which is really powerful. And if I want to use any of these channels, I can always go back and see which one's going to give me the right selection, what I'm trying to do. The blue channel here, you can see that there's some details in the grass. Look at the green channel, a little bit more flat. Look at the red channel, still a little bit flat. Let's go back to the blue again. You can see how there's these little spots here. It almost looks like it would actually make a good black and white version of this because there's so much personality. Well, since I have that intact with the blue channel already, what would happen if we added some luminosity to the blue channel just in this area? And I'm going to do luminosity with curves. Let's add curves. Instead of dodging and burning, let's add curves. And when I add curves, let's just go ahead and drag this to the left a little bit. And you can see that my grass is starting to get a little bit more dynamic. I'm going to black this out. And I'm going to brush in these curves. And these curves only exist inside of the blue, which is exactly what I want. And with an opacity of 10%, I'm just going to go ahead and brush this in. And that's going to create more dynamic lighting in the foreground. It's really, really nice. Back in the curves here, I can make it even more intense if I want to, and I can bring out those details. Add a little bit more contrast. And I've created this custom area of intensity in this part of the image. So this is where it becomes all about your own creativity. If I hide this mask, you can see how it applies to everything. So I can either dodge and burn these areas back in, or I can add the curves, or I can add more layers. If I wanted to add some warmth in this area to offset some of the green, I could start doing this in the blue channel as well. What I want to do just to kind of finalize this image is I'm going to paint a little bit more here. I want these rocks to pop a little bit more just in some of these areas here, especially near the areas of lighting. I just want that to be a sort of a hotter area of light emitting from this sun. If I go back into the red channel, I can do the same thing here by just adding a little bit more intensity from that sunburst and maybe even a little bit more color around that sunburst here. And that's starting to look pretty good. So this is a cool way of working. You can see it's starting to look like a more complex PSD. It started off really simple, but it got a little bit more complex. Not complex in the procedure, I'd say more complex in the amount of specific control. So when you start to limit things to the color channels, you can really hone in, not just on the shadows and the highlights, but also on particular areas of interest that you want to manipulate. It doesn't mean that you can't do it just with a brush, especially with a stylus and a Wacom pen. It's really easy to do here with a tablet, pressure sensitivity, all of that really helps. I usually don't lock things down to the color channels. Sometimes I like the quick method of just painting it on because I can be really precise as well with this device. But using the color channels opens up even more possibility for more precision. So think back to the earlier tutorials when we were just using the brush, we weren't using any of the color channels. Now you could go back to those files and practice using the color channels, practice using the luminosity masking and all of these techniques that we've started to learn progressively throughout this tutorial. And that's a very cool thing about this file in particular, is that learning new abilities and applying them to new images gives you the ability to also go back and apply them to old images. So as your tool set and your arsenal of techniques improves, it allows you to revisit things with a fresh eye and a fresh approach to editing. Overall, I think this file is pretty cool. Again, it wasn't my favorite vantage point, but I had to adapt, take advantage of this really cool dynamic lighting event. And in the process, I was able to show you guys some really cool techniques for blending exposures back together, getting all the detail of really hot highlights, in this case, getting that sun to be the exact shape that we wanted. And I was able to bring up some more channel masking techniques that are really fun. So that wraps it up for this lesson. We'll see you next time when we get back to the studio.